The weight of expectations. The crown settled upon Edward's head like a curse made manifest. Westminster Abbey's ancient stones seemed to exhale centuries of accumulated dread as the Archbishop's trembling hands completed the coronation ritual. The golden circlet, heavy with jewels and heavier still with expectation, pressed down upon his skull with the weight of a millstone. In that moment, Edward Plantagenet understood with crystalline clarity that he was not receiving a blessing, he was accepting a burden that would crush him. Shadows danced between the Gothic arches, cast by countless flickering candles that seemed to whisper secrets too dark for daylight. The assembled nobles watched with eyes that held no warmth, only calculation. They measured him against his father's memory, against Longshank's iron legacy, and found him wanting before he had even spoken his first words as king. "God save the king," the Archbishop intoned, but his voice carried the hollow ring of a funeral bell. Edward felt the words settle into his bones like lead, each syllable a shackle binding him to expectations he could never fulfill. Behind him, Piers Gaveston stood among the courtiers, beautiful and foreign and damned, and Edward knew that even now, in this most sacred moment, his heart belonged not to England, but to the golden-haired Gascon who had become his world. The very stones of Westminster seemed to judge him, cold, unforgiving. Ancient, they had witnessed the crowning of warrior kings and conquerors. Now they bore witness to something else, a man who wore the crown like armor that didn't fit, who carried kingship like a cross too heavy for his shoulders. The cathedral's shadows stretched longer, reaching toward him with fingers of darkness that promised nothing but sorrow. As the ceremony concluded and the great doors swung open to admit the London crowd's roar, Edward felt the first touch of the iron that would define his reign. Not the iron of swords or chains, not yet, but the iron certainty that he was walking toward his own destruction. One crown step at a time. The beautiful destroyer peer. Gaveston moved through the court like a fallen angel who had forgotten he was damned, golden-haired and graceful. He possessed a beauty that was almost feminine in its perfection, yet carried himself with the predatory confidence of a man who knew his own power. He was Edward's salvation, and his damnation wrapped in silk and velvet, a walking contradiction that the English nobles could neither understand nor forgive. Their love affair, for what else could it be called? This obsession that consumed Edward's every waking moment bloomed like a poisonous flower in the fertile soil of court intrigue. In stolen moments between state functions, in darkened chambers where no chroniclers dared venture, Edward found the only happiness his crown would ever allow him. But happiness, in the world of medieval politics, was a luxury that kings could not afford. The court watched their king lavish titles and lands upon his favorite with the hungry attention of vultures circling carrion. The Earl of Cornwall, one of England's most ancient and prestigious titles, was bestowed upon this foreign upstart like a lover's gift. Vast estates followed, along with the king's obvious favor in all matters of state. The established nobility, men whose families had served the crown for centuries, found themselves displaced by a beautiful boy with honey-colored hair and a silver tongue. But it was not merely jealousy that turned the court against Gaveston. There was something deeper, something that touched the very foundations of how medieval men understood kingship and masculinity. Edward's devotion to his favorite violated every expectation of royal behavior, every norm that governed how a king should conduct himself. In an age where royal marriages were diplomatic instruments and personal desires were subordinated to political necessity, Edward's obvious passion for Gaveston appeared not just inappropriate, but dangerous. The whispers began in dark corners and spread like plague through the court. They spoke of unnatural acts, of a king who preferred the company of men to the duties of state, of a sovereign who had forgotten that his body belonged not to himself, but to England. The more Edward elevated Gaveston, the more his nobles began to see not their rightful king, but a weak man enslaved by desires that no true monarch should harbor. Isabella of France arrived at this poisoned court like a lamb walking into a den of wolves. 12 years old, beautiful in the way that medieval princesses were expected to be, she came to England as Edward's bride, the living seal of an alliance between two great kingdoms. But she found herself married to a man whose heart belonged entirely to another, whose attention was lavished upon his golden favorite, while she remained a decorative afterthought in her own royal household. The young queen watched her husband's devotion to Gaveston with eyes that grew harder and more calculating with each passing day. She learned the art of survival in a court where she was ignored, where her husband's affections were elsewhere engaged, where her very presence seemed to remind everyone of Edward's failure to be the king they needed. In those early years of neglect and humiliation, something cold and sharp began to grow in Isabella's heart, a splinter of ice that would eventually become an avalanche of revenge. The kingdom itself began to bleed. Military campaigns launched with fanfare ended in humiliating defeat. The Scots, led by Robert the Bruce, carved chunks from England's northern territories while Edward played favorites at court. The treasury emptied as Gaveston's appetites grew ever more expensive. The very foundations of Plantagenet power, so carefully laid by Edward's father, began to crack under the weight of a king who seemed more interested in his lover than his realm. And through it all, Gaveston remained beautiful, remained beloved by his king, remained utterly oblivious to the storm gathering around him. He was Edward's greatest joy and England's greatest curse. A man whose very existence had become a challenge to the natural order that medieval society could not tolerate. The descent into darkness. Blood on Scottish soil. The morning mist hung over Bannockburn like a shroud, and Edward should have recognized it as an omen. 23,000 English soldiers had followed their king into Scotland, the largest army ever assembled under the Plantagenet banner. Yet something felt wrong from the moment they made camp. The very air tasted of defeat, metallic and bitter, like blood in the mouth after a hard blow. Edward sat his destrier at the edge of the battlefield, resplendent in plate armor that caught the weak Scottish sun, but his hands trembled on the reins around him. His nobles waited for orders that seemed frozen in his throat. Below, in the boggy ground between the armies, Robert the Bruce's smaller force had arranged itself with the patient confidence of men who knew their ground, who had chosen their moment, who understood that sometimes the lamb could devour the lion. The battle, when it came, was not the glorious charge of chivalric romance, but a nightmare of mud and blood and screaming horses. Edward's cavalry, the pride of English warfare, foundered in the marshy ground while Scottish schiltrons bristled with spears like deadly hedgehogs. The sounds were all wrong, not the clean ring of steel on steel, but the wet thud of weapons finding flesh. The bubbling cries of men drowning in their own blood, the high screams of horses with their guts spilling onto the torn earth. Edward watched his army disintegrate with the detached horror of a man witnessing his own execution. Knights who had sworn fealty to his crown were pulled from their saddles and butchered like cattle. The Earl of Gloucester, one of England's most powerful nobles, died in the mud with his banner trampled beneath Scottish feet. The very flower of English nobility was being mowed down like wheat before the scythe, and their king could do nothing but watch. When his own household knights began to retreat, when the cries went up that the king himself was in danger, Edward's nerve finally broke. He turned his horse from the battle and fled, abandoning his army to its fate, leaving behind not just a battlefield, but his reputation, his authority, and any pretense that he was worthy of the crown he wore. Behind him, the Scottish war cries echoed across the field like the laughter of demons. The journey back to England was a procession of shame. Edward rode through the northern counties like a ghost king, his army reduced to a demoralized rabble, his nobles silent with a fury too deep for words. At every castle, every manor, every village, the same story spread: the King of England had run from battle, had abandoned his men, had proven himself a coward unworthy of his father's legacy. But the true horror of Bannockburn was not the military defeat. It was what that defeat revealed about Edward himself. In the moment of crisis, when kingship demanded courage and leadership, he had been found utterly wanting. The mystique of royal authority, that almost magical quality that transformed mere men into kings, had been stripped away in full view of both armies. Edward returned to England not as a defeated king, but as a failed man wearing a crown he no longer deserved. The aftermath was swift and merciless. The nobles who had survived the slaughter began to organize, their rage crystallizing into something harder and more dangerous than mere displeasure. Led by Edward's own cousin, Thomas of Lancaster, they formed what amounted to a shadow government, imposing restrictions on royal authority that reduced Edward to little more than a puppet dancing to their tune. The ordinances they forced upon him were not merely political constraints, but a systematic humiliation designed to strip away every prerogative of kingship. Edward could no longer appoint his own ministers, control his own treasury, or even leave the realm without parliamentary permission. Most crucially, the ordinances demanded the exile of Piers Gaveston, the removal of the king's beloved favorite as the price of political survival. The separation from Gaveston was a kind of death for Edward. The man who had been his light in the darkness of kingship, his refuge from the crushing weight of expectations, was torn from his side by the very nobles he was supposed to command. For the first time since his coronation, Edward understood that a crown could be both a symbol of ultimate power and the most perfect prison ever devised: the Queen's transformation. Isabella watched her husband weep for his exiled lover and felt something fundamental shift in her soul, like ice cracking on a winter pond. She was no longer the child bride who had come to England with dreams of romance and queenship. At 17, she had learned the hardest lesson of medieval politics: that love was a luxury and survival required a heart as cold as winter stone. The court buzzed with cruel whispers about the king's tears, about his sleepless nights, about how he stared at Gaveston's empty chambers like a widower mourning his dead wife. Isabella heard every word, absorbed every slight, catalogued every humiliation. She began to understand that her husband's weakness was not just personal failing, but political catastrophe, and that his destruction would inevitably drag her down with him unless she acted. The transformation began slowly, imperceptibly. Isabella started attending council meetings she had previously ignored, listening to the complaints of nobles who felt betrayed by their king's favoritism. She learned to read the intricate maps of courtly alliance and enmity, to understand who could be trusted, who could be bought, and who could be used. The neglected queen began to emerge as a political force in her own right. When Gaveston inevitably returned from exile, for Edward's longing proved stronger than political wisdom. Isabella watched their reunion with eyes that had learned to calculate rather than feel. She saw how her husband's face lit up like sunrise when his favorite entered the room, how his voice became gentle and warm in ways it never was when he spoke to her. She cataloged these moments of happiness not with jealousy, but with the cold precision of a strategist planning a war. The final lesson in Isabella's education came with Gaveston's death. The nobles, driven beyond endurance by the favorite's return and his renewed influence over the king, took matters into their own hands. They seized Gaveston while Edward was absent and subjected him to a mockery of trial before dragging him to Blacklow Hill for execution. Isabella was present when the news reached court, and she watched her husband receive word of his beloved's murder with an expression that burned itself into her memory. Edward collapsed as if struck by lightning, his face contorting with a grief so raw and animal that it seemed barely human. He clawed at his clothes, beat his head against the stone walls, and screamed Gaveston's name with such anguish that even his enemies felt uncomfortable. But Isabella felt something else entirely. As she watched the King of England destroy himself with grief over a dead man, she understood with crystalline clarity that weakness was not merely a character flaw, but a form of contagion that would ultimately consume everyone around it. Her husband was not just a failed king. He was a drowning man who would pull his entire kingdom down with him unless someone strong enough to swim took control. The woman who emerged from Gaveston's death was not the Isabella who had entered Edward's court. This new Isabella had learned to wear masks, to speak words that carried multiple meanings, to smile while calculating the precise moment to strike. She began to court the favor of nobles who despised her husband, to build networks of loyalty that bypassed the king entirely. Most crucially, she began to correspond with her brother, the King of France, laying the groundwork for what would eventually become her escape route from a marriage that had become a prison. The arrival of the Despensers marked the beginning of Isabella's final education in hatred. Hugh Despenser the Elder and his son became Edward's new favorites, replacing Gaveston in the king's affections and proving even more rapacious and hated than their predecessor, where Gaveston had been merely foreign and beautiful. The Despensers were English and ugly and possessed of appetites that seemed to know no bounds. They devoured lands and titles with the efficiency of locusts, accumulated wealth with methods that bordered on extortion, and wielded their influence over Edward with a casual cruelty that made even Gaveston's excesses seem modest. The kingdom groaned under their depredations, while the king seemed oblivious to everything except his new obsessions. For Isabella, the Despensers represented the final insult. She watched them treat her with barely concealed contempt, saw them whisper poison in her husband's ear, felt their influence turn Edward against her even more completely than Gaveston's beauty had ever done. They were parasites feeding on England's body politic, and her husband was not their victim, but their willing host. The moment of Isabella's final transformation came during a diplomatic mission to France in 1325. Ostensibly traveling to negotiate with her brother over disputed territories, she discovered something far more valuable than diplomatic success. She discovered freedom. Away from England, away from Edward's weakness and the Despensers' corruption. She began to remember what it felt like to be treated with respect, to have her opinions valued, to exist as something more than a decorative appendage to a failed king. It was in Paris that she met Roger Mortimer, and in meeting him, found the instrument of her revenge. Mortimer was everything Edward was not, strong where her husband was weak, decisive where Edward vacillated, burning with ambition where the king seemed content with mediocrity. More than that, Mortimer hated the Despensers with a passion that matched her own, having suffered imprisonment and exile at their hands. Their affair began as a political alliance, but quickly became something deeper and more dangerous. In Mortimer's arms, Isabella discovered not just passion, but partnership, not just desire, but shared purpose. Together, they began to plan what would become one of history's most successful invasions. Though they called it a liberation, the she-wolf of France had finally awakened, and England would tremble before her fury. The Iron Throne cracks. The invasion of shadows. September 1326 brought an invasion fleet to England's shores, but it carried more than soldiers and siege engines. It brought the concentrated fury of a woman who had been pushed beyond all endurance. Isabella's ships appeared off the Suffolk coast like harbingers of judgment, their black sails cutting through the morning mist with supernatural menace. The Queen had returned to England, but she came not as Edward's wife, but as his nemesis. The irony was almost laughable. Edward, who had cowered before Scottish spears at Bannockburn, now faced an invasion led by his own wife, with an army that numbered barely 3,000 men. By all military logic, the invasion should have been crushed before it properly began. England had castles, loyal nobles, professional soldiers, everything needed to repel a modest force of continental mercenaries and English exiles. But Isabella had brought something more powerful than armies. She had brought England's accumulated rage. The moment her forces landed, the country began to convulse with a fury that had been building for 20 years. Nobles who had suffered under the Despensers' rapacity, merchants who had been bled dry by royal taxation, peasants who had watched their young men die in foreign wars, all of them saw in Isabella's invasion not a foreign conquest, but a long overdue reckoning. The speed of Edward's collapse was breathtaking. London opened its gates to Isabella without a fight, the citizens cheering her arrival as if she were a conquering hero rather than a rebel queen. The great lords of England, men who had sworn sacred oaths of fealty to Edward's crown, declared for Isabella one after another in a cascading betrayal that left the king virtually friendless in his own kingdom. Edward's response to the crisis revealed the full depth of his inadequacy. Instead of rallying his forces or attempting to negotiate, he seemed to simply crumble under the pressure. He fled London with the Despensers, abandoning his capital to his enemies, carrying only the most portable of his treasures and what remained of his dignity. The King of England had become a fugitive in his own realm, hunted by his own wife. The pursuit that followed had elements of both tragedy and farce. Edward and his diminishing band of supporters moved from castle to castle across western England, always one step ahead of Isabella's advancing forces, never quite able to find refuge secure enough to make a stand. The great magnates who might have offered sanctuary instead slammed their gates and declared for the Queen, leaving Edward to wander his kingdom like a ghost seeking rest. The Despensers, realizing that their protection of the king had become a liability, began to demonstrate the same cowardice that had characterized their entire careers. Hugh Despenser, the elder, attempted to negotiate his surrender, offering to betray Edward in exchange for his life. Hugh the younger clung to the king with desperate tenacity, perhaps understanding that his fate was already sealed, regardless of Edward's survival. The end came near the Welsh border, where Edward had hoped to find ships that might carry him to Ireland or Gascony, anywhere beyond the reach of his wife's vengeance. But even this final hope was frustrated. The ships never materialized. The Welsh nobles declared for Isabella, and Edward found himself trapped in a landscape that had become uniformly hostile. His capture was almost anticlimactic, surrounded by Isabella's forces near Caerphilly Castle. Edward simply surrendered, perhaps recognizing that further flight was pointless. The man who had once commanded the largest kingdom in Western Europe submitted to arrest by his own wife's soldiers without resistance, without even the dignity of a final gesture of defiance. Hugh Despenser the Younger's fate provided a preview of Isabella's capacity for vengeance. He was subjected to a grotesque parody of execution that seemed designed more to entertain the watching crowd than to simply end his life. Dragged naked through the streets, castrated while still alive, disemboweled so that he could watch his own entrails burn. Despenser died screaming while Isabella watched, with the detached interest of a natural philosopher observing an experiment. The symbolism was unmistakable. Despenser's sexual organs were cut away to punish his unnatural influence over the king. His bowels were burned to cleanse the corruption he had spread through the kingdom. His head was severed to end forever the poisoned counsel he had whispered in royal ears. Isabella's revenge was not just execution, but education, a lesson written in blood and agony about the price of crossing the she-wolf of France, the caged lion. The journey from Caerphilly to Kenilworth Castle was Edward's funeral procession while he still lived. Stripped of his crown, his authority, and even his royal garments, he rode through the English countryside he had once ruled like a common prisoner being taken to judgment. The people who lined the roads to watch him pass showed no sympathy for their fallen king. Only the cruel curiosity of those witnessing the mighty brought low. Kenilworth itself was both palace and prison, beautiful enough to house a king, but secure enough to hold one. The castle's red sandstone walls had witnessed centuries of royal history, but never anything quite like this, an anointed monarch reduced to the status of a particularly valuable hostage, kept alive only because his death was not yet politically convenient. The parliamentary delegation that came to demand Edward's abdication was led by the Bishop of Hereford, a man whose ecclesiastical robes could not disguise the predatory gleam in his eyes. They found Edward in the castle's great hall, dressed in simple black clothing that made him look more like a monk preparing for death than a king preparing for abdication. The sight of their former sovereign so reduced seemed to affect some of the delegation, but not enough to change their purpose. The charges against Edward were read with the measured cadence of a funeral service. Incompetence in war, allowing favorites to rule in his place, bringing dishonor to the crown, failing to defend the realm. Each accusation fell like a blow against a man already beaten beyond resistance. But the delegation had not come for Edward's defense. They had come for his surrender, and they would not leave without it. The abdication itself was a masterpiece of political theater designed to provide legal cover for what was fundamentally a successful coup. Edward was told that he could either surrender his crown voluntarily to his son or face deposition by force, with all the uncertainty and violence that such a course might entail. The choice was no choice at all, but it allowed Isabella's regime to claim that the change of kingship had been both legal and consensual. Edward's response was to weep. Not the controlled tears of political calculation, but the raw, helpless sobbing of a man whose world was disintegrating around him. He asked for time to consider, as if there were any real choice to be made, as if his captors might simply go away and leave him to rule as before. When he finally agreed to abdicate, his voice was barely above a whisper, and the words seemed to be torn from his throat by force. The formal ceremony of abdication was conducted with all the solemnity of a coronation in reverse. Edward removed his crown, his ring of state, his scepter, all the physical symbols of kingship, and handed them to representatives of his 15-year-old son. With each item surrendered, he seemed to diminish physically, as if kingship had been the only thing keeping him upright. The crown, when he finally lifted it from his own head, seemed to fight him. His hands shook as he held it for the last time, and for a moment it looked as if he might place it back on his brow and declare the whole proceeding invalid. But the moment passed, and Edward II became simply Edward of Carnarvon, a former king whose only remaining value lay in his potential for causing trouble. Isabella watched the ceremony from behind a screen that allowed her to observe without being observed. Her face showed no triumph, no satisfaction, only the cold calculation of a woman ensuring that a necessary task was being completed properly. She had not destroyed Edward out of hatred alone, but out of political necessity. And she observed his destruction with the same detachment she might have brought to any other matter of state. The new government faced an immediate problem: what to do with their valuable prisoner. Edward alive was dangerous, a potential rallying point for opposition. A legitimate claimant to a throne now occupied by a child. Edward dead would be equally problematic, creating a martyr and potentially provoking rebellion among those who still respected the principle of legitimate kingship. The solution was elegant in its simplicity. Edward would be moved from Kenilworth, which was too comfortable and too accessible, to Berkeley Castle in Gloucestershire. Berkeley was remote, secure, and controlled by Thomas de Berkeley, a baron whose family had suffered under Edward's rule and who could be trusted to ensure that the former king remained safely contained. More importantly, Berkeley was the perfect place for a former king to die of natural causes. Remote enough to prevent rescue attempts, unhealthy enough to make illness plausible, and controlled by men who understood that Edward's continued existence was an obstacle to England's peace and their own prosperity. The transfer was carried out with utmost secrecy. Edward left Kenilworth in the dead of night, escorted by men who had been chosen for their discretion rather than their rank. As his horse carried him away from the last comfortable lodging he would ever know, Edward may have sensed that he was riding not toward another prison, but toward his grave. The Berkeley Nightmare. The Castle of Shadows. Berkeley Castle crouched on its hill like a stone beast waiting to devour whatever was offered to its maw. Built of dark limestone that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, the fortress possessed an air of ancient malevolence that made even hardened soldiers uncomfortable. The castle's towers rose against the Gloucestershire sky like accusing fingers, and the wind that whistled through its battlements carried sounds that might have been voices or might have been the cries of damned souls. Thomas de Berkeley received his royal prisoner with the grim efficiency of a man undertaking a distasteful but necessary task. Berkeley was not a cruel man by nature, but he understood the political realities of his situation. Isabella and Mortimer had entrusted him with the most dangerous prisoner in England, and they expected that prisoner to remain securely contained until such time as his existence was no longer politically inconvenient. The cell prepared for Edward was a calculated insult to his former dignity. Located in the castle's lowest level, directly above the sewers and refuse pits, it was designed to assault every sense with the accumulated filth of centuries. The walls wept with moisture that carried the stench of human waste. The floor was often ankle-deep in foul water, and the air itself seemed thick with corruption and disease. Edward was stripped of the simple comforts that even common prisoners might expect. His bedding was rotted straw that harbored vermin. His food was the kind of slop normally fed to animals, and his clothing was allowed to deteriorate until he was barely covered by rags. More than physical discomfort, these conditions were designed to break his spirit, to reduce the former King of England to something less than human. The psychological torture was more sophisticated than the physical deprivations. Edward was forced to relieve himself in the same space where he ate and slept, destroying any possibility of maintaining personal dignity. He was denied writing materials, books, or any form of mental stimulation that might help him maintain his sanity. Visitors were forbidden, cutting him off from any human contact except with his jailers. The guards themselves seemed to take pleasure in their former king's degradation. They addressed him not as Your Grace, or even by his name, but with crude epithets that stripped away every vestige of royal dignity. They made him beg for his meager rations, forced him to perform menial tasks for their amusement, and subjected him to constant humiliation, designed to make him forget that he had ever been more than their plaything. Days blended into weeks, weeks into months, and Edward began to lose his grip on time itself. The eternal twilight of his cell, broken only by the occasional flickering torch, made it impossible to distinguish between day and night. He found himself talking to phantoms, arguing with memories, reliving moments from his reign in conversations with ghosts who never answered back. The worst torture was hope. Occasionally, his guards would hint that rescue was coming, that loyal nobles were gathering to restore him to his throne, that his suffering would soon end. These false hopes would sustain him for days or weeks before being crushed by reality, leaving him more broken than before. It was a cruelty more refined than any physical torment, designed to destroy not just his body, but his soul. In his lucid moments, Edward began to understand that he was not being held for ransom or negotiation. He was being prepared for death. The conditions of his imprisonment were too harsh, too deliberately degrading, to be anything other than a slow execution. His captors were not trying to keep him healthy enough for eventual release. They were breaking him down systematically, preparing him for an end that would appear natural when it finally came. The realization should have brought despair, but instead, it brought a strange kind of peace. Edward began to pray not for rescue, but for death. Not for restoration, but for release. The man who had once trembled at the thought of losing his crown now longed only for an end to suffering that had stretched beyond all endurance. The final conspiracy, the summer of 1327, brought increasing pressure on Isabella and Mortimer to resolve the problem of Edward II permanently. Reports reached London of growing unrest among nobles who were beginning to question whether the deposition had been justified, of foreign courts asking uncomfortable questions about the former king's treatment, and of rumored plots to rescue Edward from his imprisonment. Pope John XXII had sent increasingly stern letters demanding assurance of Edward's welfare, and the papal nuncios in England were asking pointed questions about why the former king could not receive visitors or spiritual comfort. The French court, despite Isabella's family connections, was growing uncomfortable with the precedent that an anointed king could be treated so harshly by his own subjects. More troubling still were the whispers within England itself. Some nobles who had supported Edward's deposition were beginning to have second thoughts, wondering whether they had gone too far in overthrowing their legitimate king. The memory of Edward's failures was fading, while the harsh reality of Mortimer's rule was becoming increasingly apparent. A living former king was becoming a dangerous symbol around which opposition might rally. Isabella and Mortimer met in the Tower of London to discuss their options. Their conversation taking place in the same chamber where previous royal councils had planned wars and signed treaties. But this council had only one item on its agenda: how to eliminate the most inconvenient man in England without appearing to be murderers. The decision they reached was characteristic of medieval political murder in its combination of deniability and symbolism. Edward could not simply be stabbed or poisoned in an obvious manner. Such a death would create a martyr and potentially provoke rebellion. Instead, his death needed to appear natural, while simultaneously serving as a warning to others about the consequences of challenging the new order. The method they chose was both practical and symbolic, designed to reflect what they saw as Edward's greatest sins, while leaving no obvious evidence of murder. The red-hot iron that would be used was more than an execution device. It was a statement about the consequences of unnatural behavior, a punishment that fit the crime in the twisted logic of medieval justice. The selection of executioners required careful consideration. The men chosen needed to be trustworthy enough to keep secrets, skilled enough to accomplish their task efficiently, and expendable enough to be eliminated afterwards if necessary. They also needed to be sufficiently motivated by hatred or greed to overcome any natural reluctance to murder a former king. John Maltravers and Thomas Gurney were perfect for the task. Both had suffered under Edward's rule. Both had been imprisoned or exiled at various times, and both possessed the kind of casual brutality that made them capable of any atrocity if the price was right. They were also expendable men whose disappearance after the deed would raise no uncomfortable questions. The weapon itself required careful preparation. The iron rod needed to be of the right size and shape to accomplish its purpose while leaving minimal external evidence. It needed to be heated to the precise temperature that would cause internal damage without burning through the skin. Most importantly, it needed to be wielded by men who understood that failure to complete their task properly would result in their own deaths. Instructions were sent to Berkeley Castle with careful attention to detail. The murder was to take place on a night when Thomas de Berkeley was conveniently absent from the castle, providing him with plausible deniability. The body was to be prepared immediately for public viewing, using medieval embalming techniques that would destroy internal evidence while preserving external appearance. The timing was crucial. Edward's death needed to occur soon enough to prevent any rescue attempts, but not so suddenly as to appear obviously artificial. The guards who had been caring for him were instructed to begin reporting that the former king's health was declining, preparing witnesses for news of his eventual demise. Perhaps most chilling was the care taken to ensure that Edward himself would understand the meaning of his death. This was not to be a quick assassination carried out while he slept, but a deliberate execution that would allow him to comprehend the full significance of his final punishment. His killers wanted him to know that he was dying not just because he was politically inconvenient, but because he had violated the fundamental norms of kingship and masculinity. The conspiracy was a masterpiece of medieval political calculation, designed to eliminate a threat while sending a message that would echo through the centuries. But it was also something darker, a glimpse into the kind of refined cruelty that emerges when political necessity combines with personal hatred and the absolute power to act without consequences. The Iron Confession, September 21st, 1327. The night came to Berkeley Castle like a shroud, bringing with it a silence that seemed too deep, too complete. Even the usual sounds of castle life, the calls of sentries, the clatter of horses in the courtyard, the distant voices of servants about their duties were muffled as if the very stones held their breath in anticipation of what was to come. Edward lay on his rotting straw, no longer fully aware of the passage of time. Months of degradation had reduced him to something barely recognizable as the man who had once worn England's crown. His hair hung in greasy tangles, his beard was matted with filth, and his eyes held the hollow stare of someone who had looked too long into the abyss of his own failure. The sound of footsteps in the corridor should have been unremarkable. Guards moved through the castle at all hours, but something about these particular footsteps was different. They moved with purpose, with the measured cadence of men approaching a task they had rehearsed many times in their minds. Edward stirred on his bed of straw, some animal instinct warning him that death was approaching. The cell door opened with its familiar screech of rusted hinges, but instead of the usual guard bringing slop that passed for food, 3 figures entered. Maltravers and Gurney moved like shadows given substance, their faces hidden beneath deep hoods that made them appear more like executioners from a fever dream than mortal men. Behind them came a third figure, carrying something that glowed with hellish light. Edward struggled to sit up, his body responding sluggishly after months of poor treatment. In the flickering light of their torch, he could see that his visitors carried more than the usual instruments of humiliation. The iron rod that Gurney held was cherry red with heat, radiating warmth that Edward could feel from across the cell. The sight of it triggered a primal terror that cut through months of despair with crystalline clarity. "No," Edward whispered, the word emerging as barely more than a breath. He scrambled backward until his shoulders pressed against the damp stone wall, his hands raised in a futile gesture of protection. "Please, no." Maltravers stepped forward, his voice carrying the cold satisfaction of a man settling an old score. "Edward of Caernarvon," he said, using the title that stripped away even the pretense of royalty. "Your time has come." The former king tried to speak, to bargain, to plead, but terror had stolen his voice. He could only watch as his executioners moved with the practiced efficiency of butchers preparing their trade. A heavy table was dragged from the corner, thick oak planks that had perhaps once held royal feasts, but now served a darker purpose. Restraints of rope and leather were produced, tools that spoke of careful preparation and grim intent. "Do you understand why this must be?" Gurney asked, his words carrying a perverse kindness that made them more terrifying than any threat. "Do you comprehend what your unnatural appetites have cost this realm?" Edward found his voice at last, though it emerged as a broken whisper. "I was anointed by God. I am your king." "You were a king," Maltravers corrected. "Now, you are only a man who must answer for his sins." The struggle that followed was brief and futile. Edward's months of imprisonment had sapped his strength, and his captors were younger, stronger, fed on purpose and hatred. They bore him to the table with the inexorable force of destiny itself, securing his limbs with restraints that spoke of long practice in such dark arts. The iron, when they showed it to him properly, was a thing of terrible beauty, perfectly smooth, heated to the precise temperature that would serve their purpose. It glowed like a fallen star in the darkness of the cell. Edward stared at it with the fascination of a bird confronting a serpent, understanding at last the full meaning of his punishment. For your unnatural relations, Gurney intoned like a priest delivering benediction. For your failure as a king. For the shame you brought upon England's crown. The act itself was mercifully brief, though Edward's screams echoed through Berkeley's stones with such anguish that they seemed to shake the very foundations. The iron found its mark with surgical precision, burning away not just flesh, but any possibility that this death could be questioned or investigated. The internal organs that cooked and burst would leave no trace for curious physicians to discover. No evidence that might contradict the story of natural death that was already being prepared. When the screaming finally stopped, when Edward's body had ceased its convulsions and lay still upon the oak table, a profound silence settled over the cell. Even his killers seemed awed by what they had accomplished, by the finality of ending a life that had once commanded kingdoms and armies. For a moment, the magnitude of regicide hung in the air like incense from some profane mass. The cleanup was swift and thorough. Edward's body was immediately prepared for viewing. Positioned on his bed of straw in a pose that suggested peaceful death rather than violent murder. The table was scrubbed clean of any evidence. The iron rod returned to the forge where it would be reheated and worked into some innocent implement. The cell itself was cleansed of any trace that might suggest violence had occurred within its walls. By dawn, the story was already spreading through the castle. The former king had died in his sleep, overcome by grief and the poor conditions of his imprisonment. Thomas de Berkeley, returning conveniently from his absence, expressed appropriate sorrow at the news while privately congratulating himself on his perfect alibi. The guards who had witnessed nothing saw nothing, and those who might have seen too much were already marked for their own elimination. Echoes in iron, the price of vengeance. The funeral of Edward II was a masterpiece of political theater that would have impressed Machiavelli himself. The body lay in state at Gloucester Cathedral, displayed for all to see that the former king bore no obvious marks of violence. Medieval embalming techniques, primitive though they were, had preserved the corpse well enough to maintain the fiction of natural death while simultaneously destroying any internal evidence of murder. Isabella attended the ceremony dressed in the deepest mourning, her face a mask of grief so perfect that even those who knew the truth of Edward's death found themselves moved by her apparent sorrow. She played the role of bereaved widow with such conviction that chroniclers would later write of her inconsolable loss, never suspecting that her tears were for the man she had once loved, rather than the king she had destroyed. The great nobles of England filed past Edward's bier with expressions ranging from genuine sorrow to barely concealed relief. Many who had supported his deposition now found themselves uncomfortably aware that they had participated in regicide, that they had helped destroy an anointed king whose only crime had been weakness rather than wickedness. The guilt would eat at some of them for years to come, a poison that would ultimately contribute to Isabella and Mortimer's own downfall. But the most chilling aspect of the funeral was not the pageantry, but the systematic elimination of witnesses that began even as the ceremony proceeded. John Maltravers, one of Edward's killers, was found dead in his chambers the morning after the funeral, apparently having succumbed to a sudden fever. Thomas Gurney disappeared entirely, his body never found, though rumors persisted for years that he had been seen in various continental ports before vanishing forever. The guards who had been present at Berkeley during Edward's final imprisonment met similar fates with remarkable consistency. Some died in accidents that were almost certainly arranged. Others simply vanished without explanation. And still others were found dead under circumstances that suggested they had learned the value of permanent silence. Isabella and Mortimer were taking no chances that inconvenient witnesses might develop inconvenient consciences. Thomas de Berkeley himself, despite his careful alibi, lived the rest of his life under a cloud of suspicion that never entirely lifted. Though he was never formally accused of participating in Edward's murder, the whispers followed him everywhere he went. His children and grandchildren would bear the stain of association with regicide, a mark that no amount of loyal service could entirely erase. The international reaction to Edward's death was more muted than might have been expected, partly because most European courts were privately relieved to see England's political crisis resolved. However, the speed and convenience of the former king's demise raised eyebrows in papal and imperial circles, where the principles of divine right and legitimate monarchy were taken more seriously than in the practical world of English politics. Young Edward III, now truly king rather than merely a figurehead, absorbed the lessons of his father's fate with the intensity of a scholar studying a particularly important text. The boy who had been crowned at 15 while his father still lived watched his mother and Mortimer consolidate their power with the detached interest of someone learning statecraft from the most ruthless possible teachers. The new king said nothing about his father's death, made no inquiries about the circumstances of his passing, and showed no outward signs of suspicion about the convenient timing of Edward II's demise. But those close to him began to notice a hardness in the young monarch's eyes, a calculation that had not been there before his father's death. The boy was learning not just how to rule, but how to survive in a world where even kings could be murdered if they showed weakness. The wheel of fortune that had carried Isabella and Mortimer to the heights of power began its inevitable turn toward destruction. Their rule, built on the foundation of murder and sustained by fear, contained the seeds of its own collapse. The very ruthlessness that had made their coup successful gradually alienated the nobles who had initially supported them, creating the conditions for their eventual downfall. Mortimer's appetite for power and wealth proved as insatiable as that of the dispensers he had replaced. He accumulated titles and estates with rapacious efficiency, created himself Earl of March without royal consent, and began to behave more like a king than the regent he was supposed to be. The nobles who had helped him overthrow Edward II began to realize that they had simply exchanged one form of tyranny for another. More dangerous still was the growing awareness that Edward III, now approaching his majority, would eventually demand real power rather than ceremonial authority. Mortimer understood this threat and began to take steps to neutralize it, but his actions only served to accelerate the crisis he was trying to prevent. The young king was not his father. He possessed intelligence, courage, and most importantly, the ability to learn from others' mistakes. The coup that ended Mortimer's dominance was as swift and decisive as the invasion that had brought him to power. In October 1330, Edward III struck without warning, arresting Mortimer at Nottingham Castle while Isabella watched helplessly. The charges against Mortimer included the murder of Edward II, suggesting that even the new king believed his father had been murdered rather than having died naturally. Mortimer's execution was carried out with the same efficiency he had once brought to eliminating his own enemies. He was hanged, drawn, and quartered at Tyburn. His death providing grim satisfaction to those who remembered the fates of Gaveston and the Despensers. The man who had lived by violence died by violence, completing a cycle of revenge that had consumed 3 generations of English politics. Isabella's fate was more complex. Edward III could not execute his own mother without causing a scandal that would damage his own legitimacy. But neither could he allow her to remain a political force. The solution was elegant. Isabella was granted a comfortable retirement to Castle Rising in Norfolk, where she would live out her remaining years in luxury, but also in complete political isolation. The she-wolf of France spent her final decades in a kind of gilded cage, surrounded by beautiful tapestries and fine wines, but cut off from the political world that had once trembled at her name. She never remarried, never attempted to regain political influence, and rarely spoke of the events that had brought her to power. Whether this silence reflected genuine repentance or merely prudent caution, no contemporary record reveals. The truth about Edward II's death became one of history's most persistent mysteries, with each generation of chroniclers and historians offering their own interpretations of the events at Berkeley Castle. Some accepted the official story of natural death, others whispered of murder, and still others created elaborate theories about Edward's escape and secret survival. The uncertainty served political purposes, allowing later rulers to interpret the story according to their own needs. But the impact of Edward's fate extended far beyond questions of historical fact. The precedent that an anointed king could be deposed and killed if he proved inadequate established principles that would echo through English political development for centuries. The idea that kingship was conditional upon effective rule, rather than being an absolute divine right, took root in English political consciousness, eventually contributing to the constitutional crises that would define later centuries. Edward III's reign became a systematic repudiation of everything his father had represented. Where Edward II had been weak, his son was strong. Where the father had failed in war, the son achieved glorious victories. Where Edward II had neglected his duties for personal pleasure, Edward III subordinated everything to the demands of effective kingship. The new king's success served as both vindication of the deposition and a monument to the lessons learned from his father's failure. The iron crown that had crushed Edward II became, in his son's hands, a symbol of power wielded with skill and purpose. But those who knew the truth about what had happened at Berkeley Castle understood that every crown carries within it the seeds of its own destruction, that every king rules not just by divine grace, but by the consent of those who possess the power to withdraw that consent. The final irony of Edward II's story is that his death accomplished exactly what his life had failed to achieve. It established him as a figure of lasting historical significance. The king who had been forgotten while he lived became unforgettable in death, his fate serving as a warning and a reminder about the price of political failure and the terrible consequences that can follow when personal weakness meets political necessity. Today, nearly 7 centuries after that September night at Berkeley Castle, Edward II's tomb in Gloucester Cathedral still draws visitors who come to contemplate the fate of the king who had everything and lost it all. The stone effigy shows him in royal robes, crowned and sceptered as if death had restored the dignity that life had stripped away. But those who know the true story of his end understand that the real monument to Edward II is not carved in stone, but written in the darker chapters of human history, where power and weakness, love and hatred, justice and revenge meet in combinations too complex for simple moral judgment. The Iron Crown's shadow falls across every throne, reminding those who would be kings that their power is never absolute, their position never secure, and their fate never entirely in their own hands. In the end, Edward II's legacy is not the story of how a king died, but the eternal reminder that even the mightiest can fall when they forget that crowns are worn by mortal men who remain subject to the iron laws of political survival.